They found her birth records buried under dust and silence, a name scratched out, rewritten, then erased again. The only trace left was a faded photograph of a young woman with eyes too old for her face. Locals called her the child of mirrors, because when she looked at you, it felt like she was seeing something you couldn't bear to know about yourself. She lived and died in a small, forgotten town in the Appalachian hills, a place that still refuses to speak her name. But behind that silence lies a story that America tried to bury, a story of bloodlines that twisted in on themselves until they became a curse. Before we go deeper into this dark story, make sure to subscribe to American Shadow, the place where real American crime stories come to life. Hit the like button if you're hooked, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this case. Her life was not shaped by choice or fate, but by a family that could not let go of its own reflection. Generations of fear, superstition, and pride locked together until her birth became a final act of defiance against nature itself. Her mother was her cousin, her father was her uncle, and her entire existence was built on a web of lies spun to keep the family name pure. The woman you're about to meet never left her hometown. She never saw the world beyond the valley that raised her. And yet, her body, her face, became the evidence of everything that went wrong when love, shame, and blood all tangled into one. Historians tried to erase her. Doctors refused to study her. The church called her birth a sin, but the townsfolk, they called her a warning. The last daughter of a line that should never have continued. What happened to her, and how her family's secret was finally uncovered, would take more than a century to come to light. This isn't just a story about inbreeding. It's about control, isolation, and the darkness that grows when a family decides that no one outside its walls deserves to exist. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some records were burned, and why the grave you'll see in the final minutes bears no last name, only one word, carved in stone: forgiven. The story of the woman begins long before she was born, with a family name that once held power. They were landowners, preachers, and judges, bound by faith and pride. To outsiders, they were pillars of the community. But behind closed doors, their house was a shrine to secrecy. They believed their blood was blessed, chosen by God to remain untouched by the sins of the outside world. Marrying within the family, they said, was not corruption. It was protection. It started small, two cousins joining hands in the candlelight of an old church. Then a brother marrying a half-sister to keep inheritance where it belonged. Each generation tightened the circle a little more, until the branches of their family tree no longer spread outward. They began to twist around each other, like a vine choking its own roots. By the late 1800s, the family had withdrawn completely. They stopped attending town gatherings, stopped sending their children to school. They grew their own food, buried their own dead, and whispered to each other that the outside world had fallen into sin. To them, purity meant isolation, and isolation over time became madness. Letters from traveling ministers tell stories of strange rituals in the valley. Candles burning in daylight, children speaking in tongues, a woman praying to mirrors instead of crosses. But no one dared confront them. The family owned most of the land, and those who asked too many questions found their livestock dead, their windows shattered, their homes marked with crosses drawn in ash. By the time the woman's mother was born, the family had become a legend of its own, a ghost story whispered by children and denied by adults. The local preacher warned his flock never to go near the old homestead after sundown. But one boy did. He saw something moving behind the windows, pale faces watching, not in curiosity but in hunger. And from that hunger, a child would one day be born, a child who carried the weight of every forbidden union that came before her. She would be the end of her family's line, not by choice, but by consequence. She was born on a night without stars. The wind had gone still, the air heavy and unmoving, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Her mother, barely 16, screamed into the hollow of an abandoned farmhouse while her father, her own uncle, whispered prayers that sounded more like curses. No midwife came, no doctor dared. The family had long since delivered their own, and buried their own when they didn't survive. When she entered the world, the cries stopped too soon. Her skin was ghost pale, her features distorted, as though molded by too many hands of the same blood. But her eyes were perfect, clear gray and sharp like two small mirrors reflecting everyone's fear back at them. The family took it as a sign. The child was chosen, they said, a vessel to carry the pure line forward. They named her only by her first name, Evelyn. Evelyn never saw the world beyond those valley walls. She was raised in the shadows of her ancestors, surrounded by faces that looked too similar, voices that all carried the same soft madness. She learned to read from torn Bible pages, to pray to the same portraits her parents whispered to each night. Portraits of long, dead relatives who still hung in the hallway, their eyes following her wherever she went. By the time she could walk, she already knew what silence meant. If you heard footsteps outside after sundown, you didn't open the door. If a stranger came up the path, you blew out the lamps and hid behind the curtains. The family said outsiders carried sickness, not just of the body, but of the soul. Evelyn's body grew frail. Her spine curved, her speech lagged, her limbs trembled when she stood too long. The neighbors who sometimes glimpsed her from afar spoke of her as if she were an apparition, a girl who looked like a child, even as the years passed. But inside that fragile frame was something else, something aware. She kept journals no one in the family knew about. In them she wrote of dreams where the walls melted away, and she could breathe air that wasn't soaked in history. Dreams where she wasn't defined by her last name. And in those dreams, she began to question the one thing her family demanded: loyalty. The house where Evelyn grew up still stands, barely. The walls lean inward, the windows sag beneath the weight of time, and the mirrors still hang where her ancestors placed them. Each one cracked in a different pattern, like veins running through glass. To the family, those mirrors weren't decoration, they were witnesses, silent observers of every birth, every death, every sin committed in the name of blood. Evelyn's mother told her that the mirrors kept the family safe, that through reflection, the ancestors could watch over them. But Evelyn began to notice something else. When she stood alone, she would see movements in the glass that didn't match her own, faces appearing where there should be none. A man's eyes in the reflection when no one else was in the room. The family rarely spoke of the past aloud, but the house did. At night, it groaned and whispered, the old wood creaking like a voice trying to speak through the walls. Evelyn would lie awake, her heart pounding, listening to the sounds of footsteps, pacing the hallway outside her door. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to belong to her frail mother. Her father would pray for hours, his voice hoarse, his eyes fixed on a mirror above the mantel. He'd whisper names that didn't belong to anyone alive. Names repeated for generations. Names she'd later find carved into the beams of the attic. Initials joined together by crosses, dates overlapping as if time itself had become trapped inside the house. Evelyn's health worsened as the years went on. Her bones ached, her vision blurred, and she began to hear things even when she was awake. Whispers that seemed to crawl out from behind the mirrors. Sometimes she would answer them. Sometimes she would scream back. It was during one of those nights that Evelyn wrote the first words that truly belonged to her. Not to the family, not to their God, but to herself. I see them now, she wrote. Not as protectors, as prisoners. And I think I am one of them. Those words were found decades later, tucked behind a rotting floorboard, in handwriting that trembled but refused to break. It was the first sign that Evelyn wasn't just the end of her bloodline. She was trying to escape it. The year Evelyn turned 20 was the year the town began to talk again. Someone had seen her wandering the edge of the woods, barefoot, trembling, her hair tangled and her dress torn. She had walked as far as the river before turning back, staring at the reflection in the water as if it might speak to her. That was the first time she ever tried to leave. Her mother locked her in her room for 3 days afterward. No food, no light, only a small bowl of water and the creak of footsteps outside her door. When her father finally opened it, he didn't speak. He simply pointed to the mirror hanging on the opposite wall, the largest one in the house. Look, he told her. Look at who you are. She did. And what she saw wasn't herself, not anymore. Her face seemed stretched, uneven, her eyes too large, her mouth slightly off-center. Whether it was the mirror or her own blood distorting her reflection, she couldn't tell. But in that moment, she began to understand that she would never escape through the front door. The only way out was through the truth, through everything her family had hidden. She began sneaking into the attic at night, reading old letters by candlelight. They were written by women who shared her name, great-grandmothers, aunts, cousins. Each one spoke of the same pain, the same sickness, the same strange commandment: keep the blood clean. But as the years went on, the tone of the letters changed. The last ones were filled with fear, pleas for forgiveness, mentions of babies born blind, of children who didn't speak, of voices that called from mirrors asking to be let out. Evelyn started hearing those voices too. But unlike the others before her, she listened. And one night, she whispered back, I forgive you. Something in the house changed after that. The air felt lighter, the silence less suffocating. But the family didn't. Her father called her possessed. Her mother cried and begged her to repent. And for the first time, Evelyn spoke words her ancestors never dared to say. You were wrong. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run or would you stay and face it? Not long after that night, the house began to die with them. The crops failed, the livestock sickened. The family, once proud of its pure blood, fell apart one body at a time. Evelyn's father wasted away first, muttering prayers that turned into nonsense as fever claimed him. They said he died clutching his reflection, his handprint smeared across the mirror above the mantel like a warning left for no one. Her mother followed soon after, slipping into a kind of madness that blurred prayer with delirium. She called Evelyn by the names of women long dead, and sometimes, when she looked at her daughter, she screamed, as if she saw not a person, but the face of every sin her bloodline had buried. When Evelyn was left alone, the house went silent for the first time in generations. No footsteps, no voices, just her and the mirrors. She covered them all, one by one, with sheets torn from the beds. But even hidden, she could feel them watching, the weight of her family's past pressing against her from behind the walls. That winter, she stopped eating. She wrote in her journal until her hands shook too much to hold a pen. She described seeing her ancestors in the corners of her room, not as ghosts but as shapes of light and dust. Watching, waiting, judging. In her final entry, she wrote, "The bloodline ends tonight. Not by death but by release. No one knows exactly how she died." When the sheriff finally entered the property months later, he found the house rotting from within, the air thick with mold and silence. Evelyn's body was in the parlor, sitting upright in a wooden chair, a mirror shattered at her feet. Her eyes were open, her face calm, and written on the wall behind her, in what looked like soot, were the same words that marked her grave later. Forgiven. The officials sealed the property, burned what they could, and buried what was left. But even after the smoke cleared, people said they could see her shadow in the windows, standing beside the mirrors she had tried to destroy, a reflection with no one left to reflect. For nearly 50 years, Evelyn's story was forgotten. The house fell into ruin, the land overgrown and swallowed by the forest. Locals told stories about strange lights flickering through the trees, about voices calling from empty rooms, but time has a way of burying horror beneath folklore. Until, one summer in 1972, a group of researchers from a nearby university arrived. They were studying patterns of genetic disorders in isolated rural communities. What they found in the valley shocked even them. The old records still existed, hidden in the county archives. Marriage licenses, birth certificates, medical reports that never reached the state. The same surnames repeated again and again, looping back on themselves. It was a closed circle, spanning nearly 200 years. Evelyn's family wasn't just a rumor. It was a documented lineage of intermarriage so extensive that, by the time she was born, her DNA was almost identical on both sides. The researchers visited the ruins of the house. They found fragments of mirrors buried in the soil, each one etched with initials. Beneath one cracked frame, they discovered a rusted box wrapped in rotting cloth. Inside were Evelyn's journals, still legible, still trembling with her handwriting. Page after page, she described the world inside that house, the fear, the rituals, the guilt, but also something else, compassion. A quiet, desperate empathy for the people who had made her what she was. In her final pages, she wrote they weren't monsters, they were afraid. They thought the world outside would break them, but it was the walls that did it. The researchers published their findings years later, anonymized to protect what was left of the family's name. But those who read the report knew. It wasn't just science, it was tragedy, a reminder that isolation, pride, and shame can twist love into something unrecognizable. Today, the valley is empty, the house is gone. Only the foundation remains, buried under weeds and moss. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick across the hills, locals say you can still hear a faint sound, not weeping, not whispering, just the soft, steady hum of glass breaking in the dark. Evelyn's story didn't end with her death. It began there. The journals she left behind forced historians and scientists alike to confront an uncomfortable truth. That horror doesn't always come from violence or malice. Sometimes it comes from love, twisted, misguided, and locked away from the world until it rots into obsession. Her family thought they were preserving something sacred. In reality, they were preserving their own undoing. Generations of silence became the true curse. No one challenged the rules, no one spoke the truth aloud. Every whisper, every warning, every "don't ask" became another brick in the prison they built together. Evelyn was the first to break that silence, and the last to pay for it. In a way, she was both victim and savior. Her defiance ended the cycle, but it cost her everything. The town moved on. New families settled the valley, unaware of the bones and stories beneath their feet. But the locals never forgot entirely. They still avoid that patch of land at dusk. They still lower their voices when a stranger asks about the house that once stood there. Some say the air feels heavier near where her grave lies. Not haunted, exactly, but remembering. And maybe that's what Evelyn wanted. Not revenge, not redemption, but remembrance. That someone someday would speak her story out loud. That her life, however broken, might mean something beyond the shame that built it. When you think of her, don't see her as a monster born of sin. See her as a mirror, reflecting what happens when truth is buried long enough to fester. A reflection of families who cared more about appearance than honesty. A reflection of how easily love turns cruel when bound by fear. There are hundreds of valleys like hers across America, hidden under different names, buried under time and denial. And maybe, right now, one of them is still keeping its silence. But silence never lasts forever, because the past, no matter how deep it's buried, always finds its way back to the surface. Sometimes in records, sometimes in whispers, and sometimes in the eyes of those who still carry its reflection. This story is based on historical and psychological research into isolated American family lines. All names and locations have been altered to preserve anonymity. Viewer discretion is advised.